Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the SICW 2020 Fireside Chat. We will begin the live stream in a few minutes, so please stay tuned. While we are waiting for the event to begin, please take this opportunity to participate in the audience poll. We would love to hear your answers to the question, describe the state of cyberspace today in one word. Your answers will be displayed live as part of the word cloud on the right of your screen. There will also be an opportunity to interact with our three panelists by participating in the Q&A segment. You'll be able to submit your questions for our distinguished panelists through the Q&A engagement panel later in the event. Should you require any assistance, please click on the chat icon on the bottom right of the screen to speak with our live technical support. Good evening to everyone joining us here today from all over the world. Welcome to the 5th edition of Singapore International Cyber Week, Cooperation in a Post-COVID Future. I'm Stephanie Bovis, your host for the SICW 2020 Fireside Chat. The Fireside Chat is the signature event to kick off the SICW 2020. The theme for the Fireside Chat is the future tech landscape bipolar? This session brings together distinguished panelists for a conversation on the future of the global tech landscape, drawing on perspectives and the rich experience gained from their leadership roles in the public and private sectors. The Fireside Chat will discuss issues such as advancing global cyber stability, securing emerging tech, strengthening public-private partnerships, and seizing digital opportunities. The session will include a Q&A, so please take this opportunity to interact with the speakers live. You can submit your questions in the Q&A engagement panel on the right of your screen. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our moderator for the session, Chief International Correspondent for Southeast Asia, Bloomberg, Ms. Haslinda Amin. Ms. Amin, please.
Stephanie, thank you so much for that. Hello, and thank you for joining us from wherever you are in the world. We hope that you're doing well. What a year it's been, and we're nowhere close to the end of all the uncertainties. What is certain, though, is that the pandemic has created new paradigm shifts, accelerated existing trends, all coinciding with rising geopolitical tensions in all areas, including trade, technology, the disruptions to borders, supply chains, and national technology. They're a stark reminder of how interconnected, interdependent we all are. So how can the world still work together to build a stable international environment for all to develop, for all to prosper? Well, it's my great privilege to introduce to you the speakers for tonight, as Iswaran is Singapore's Minister in charge of cybersecurity, Murat Sonmez, Managing Director at the World Economic Forum, and Said Ali, co-head of Bain & Company's Global Cybersecurity Advisory. Gentlemen, good to have you with us. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Minister, I'm going to start out with you. There's this perception that geopolitical tensions and the competition in the tech space will be long-term issues. Are we then looking at the start of the end of globalization, or are we looking at a reshaping of globalization?
Thank you, Haslinda, for the question. And first to Murat and Syed, and also to everyone who's joining in. Welcome. Extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures, and this is our way of making sure we continue the important dialogue on cybersecurity. I think, Haslinda, on your specific question, essentially, I would say this. I think the challenge we face, whether it's in the tech and cyberspace or in, if you take it a bit further, in terms of the environment, or in terms of what we are facing today in COVID-19 and the pandemic, what is clear is we are being made increasingly aware of the global commons. More and more of the issues that we are dealing with reflect the fact that our destinies are intertwined. And in many cases, what I think we come to the conclusion very quickly is that no one is safe until everyone is safe. So whether you're talking about the pandemic and our response to it, or cybersecurity and cyberspace, we need a response from the League of Nations, working together in partnership in order to establish norms and rules and also protocols in the way we deal with these challenges. And then ensuring that we are compliant so that we can build trust and confidence. So I would say actually, in an ironic kind of way, the need for globalization and for greater global cooperation is perhaps accentuated by these sorts of challenges. And yes, whilst there are forces that are pulling us apart in some ways, they actually reinforce the importance of why we need to work together and stay the course.
You talk about challenging norms and rules, and of course, one person who comes to mind is the President of the United States, the US playing that role right now. Syed, does it matter who wins the US election? Does a Biden presidency, for instance, necessarily mean a better chance of globalization surviving?
Haslinda, I mean, from our perspective, or at least from my personal perspective, it does feel like Biden is, given his history in the Obama administration, he's a little bit more open to cooperation, working with other standards bodies, for example, to define new protocols, define new thresholds. So that would be my guess, is that his administration is going to be a little bit more open and willing to get back to the old norms of multilateralism when it comes to whether it's cybersecurity policy or pandemic policies, et cetera, sharing data between countries, between other organizations. It does feel like his administration is going to be a little bit more open to that.
A little bit more open, Syed, but Biden himself has said that China is the biggest threat to security in the world. I mean, therein lies the tension, right? I mean, hence the question whether he will necessarily be the better man to push through globalization.
Well, I mean, I think what Biden's hinting at is the one of the fundamental issues that the Trump administration and his administration have been aligned on, which is the fact that they have seen data on the Homeland Security side that indicates that China is indirectly or sometimes directly continuing to either encourage or directly attack certain sectors within the U.S., certain sectors within the European Union, et cetera. For various purposes, right? So I think those are some of the things that they're trying to resolve before they are able to, move towards better cooperation and better standardization across these other fronts.
If I may just say something in terms of a sort of broader perspective on this, I would say that this is really about as I said earlier, it's about the whole community of nations coming together to deal with the pressing issues. It is inevitable that because of political fluctuations and so on, individual countries may have challenges. And of course, the US and China and others, EU, are big players. But if you take the WTO as a case in point, we have an issue with the appointment of judges to the appellate body. But meanwhile, whilst that is being resolved at a multilateral level, other nations, led by the EU, Canada, and so on, and we are active participants in that, are working on solutions that can take us forward. And then, of course, we hope that we will find that overarching multilateral solution in due course. I'm just trying to make the point that at the end of the day, there will be a sense of purpose and pragmatism in the way I think countries come together. And of course, we want all the nations to come together, but there might be fluctuations because of individual countries.
So it's a coalition of like-minded economies. We'll pick up on that issue. Minister, for now, Murad, what's your view on the future of multilateralism? How does it look to you at this point in time?
Well, as strange as it may sound, it looks really promising. As Minister Iswaran mentioned, there are fundamental issues that impact everybody, whether it's environment, state of ocean, improving agriculture yields, reducing congestion in the cities, and dealing with health issues like COVID-19. So I think when we should not conflate multilateralism with unanimity. I think achieving global consensus will be even harder, as we've seen that in veto-based organizations. I think consensus will be hard. What we're seeing is, however, is desire from many countries, including China, United States, EU, to collaborate on agreed upon commons or purposes, and really having a multi-stakeholder discussion and dialogue and formulation of solutions and implementation. So we're seeing the shift from unanimity to interoperability. I think everybody would want to accelerate the cure for COVID-19, and data plays a key role here. And who owns the data? What can you do with it? And how do you distribute the economic benefits of data will be the key questions as we move forward.
Murad, interesting to note that our participants were asked to perhaps come up with a word to describe the state of globalization right now. And one of the words that came through was evolving. I mean, it needs to evolve, yes, because the globalization that we know now, that is happening now, has not benefited everybody on an equal scale. So that there needs to be evolution.
It needs to be a rapid evolution, maybe a revolution, because technology is not waiting for us to figure out how to yield positive outcome for everyone. We had that luxury before the age of the internet, but now technology is moving much faster than our traditional approaches has been able to cope with. So we need to really look at a forward-looking and agile approach to addressing these challenges and also the opportunities.
Syed, we talk about multi-stakeholders here, right? States, non-states. What roles can they play to mitigate the impact of a bifurcated world? First, of course, maybe your view, unpack that for us. What's a bifurcated world, what it means?
Right. So I can speak about bifurcation when it comes, from a technological perspective and specifically, the impacts on cybersecurity. At the highest level, bifurcation just means that you're splitting standards. That one side versus the other side is doing the research, establishing what the norm will be when it comes to hardware, software. So, for example, it ranges from what are the standards going to be for the various pieces of hardware that are responsible and essentially rolling out 5G technology. It could be any component on the network side, for example, establishing the standards for that, how they communicate with each other, all the way down to the software level when it comes to the operating system and the applications and how data is stored, where data is stored, what are the guidelines. So what we're seeing is that bifurcation means that two or more entities, it could be collective or individual entities, are establishing standards that are disparate from each other. And the implications for cybersecurity are going to be pretty significant because we have other analogies where we have seen a split of standards. For example, on the standard enterprise side, the cybersecurity products and services that are used to manage your laptop, your corporate laptop, corporate applications are different than your technologies that are used to manage on the IoT side or the solutions that are not like classic enterprise oriented in nature. And so cybersecurity solutions have had to split essentially because of that. The other implications of bifurcation that we're going to see are going to be less collaboration on research, less access to various pieces of research early on when they're being peer reviewed or approved, less sharing of patent or patented technology or other pieces of information that are vital for developing and furthering whatever the standard is that is being bifurcated. And then certainly we're going to see implications for things like, the supply chain and training, people, hiring, et cetera. I mean, it's going to be pretty far and wide. One thing that I would like to point out, though, is that bifurcation is not going to be sort of everywhere or on, at every level. It's going to be limited to certain things that are hot right now. So bifurcation on 5G, bifurcation maybe on, artificial intelligence, et cetera.
We heard, of course, from the Monetary Authority of Singapore chief, Ravi Menon, saying that a bifurcated world does not benefit anyone at all. So how do states, non-states position themselves to mitigate the impact of a bifurcated world? Murad, your views on that?
I think, again, the keyword is multi-stakeholder collaboration and agreeing on global commons. And we just have to put our heads down and agree on what is common and how do we move forward in an effective way. Because if we don't move forward together, we will not make progress. And as I said before, through the activities of the World Economic Forum, we've seen an increased level of desire from all parties to make it happen. Because if parts of the society or nations are left behind, in the fourth industrial revolution, when technology is moving much faster, it's not going to be morally right, it's not going to be socially right, and it's not going to be economically right. And I think there's a wide understanding on this topic and the importance of multi-stakeholder collaboration.
Minister, earlier we talked about how, or you brought up the idea of a coalition of like-minded economies. Let's take ASEAN as a case in point, because ASEAN countries have agreed on accepted behaviors, practices in cyberspace. How effective can that be in supporting a rules-based cyberspace if that agreement is non-binding?
Well, I think there's a few elements to your question. The first is, I think, a desired outcome is really a multilateral outcome, where the entire community of nations can subscribe to common standards, norms in order to collaborate on a level playing field. So the analogy would be, say, in trade and the role played by the World Trade Organization and the multilateral trading system and the rules it has, and it ensures that countries abide by them. I think in the case of cybersecurity, the work that's being done in the UN, for example, through the UN Group of Government Experts and the OEWG, I think these are very important in developing that multilateral approach towards cybersecurity. But I think there's an important role for regional efforts, binding or non-binding, for two reasons. The first is what we have seen in trade, and I think we will see increasingly in other domains, including cyberspace, is that regional partnerships or alliances amongst like-minded countries allows those countries to work together collaboratively and start moving at a pace that is perhaps faster and in a manner that is perhaps more innovative compared to what you might be able to achieve in a multilateral platform. The key thing is to ensure that they are not working at cross purposes. So for example, we talk about in trade that regional trade partnerships should be WTO consistent, right? And I think the same would apply here. So in the case of ASEAN, a couple of years ago when the ASEAN ministers in charge of cybersecurity met, we agreed that we would accept the norms that were put out in the 2015 UNGGE report, the 11 norms. And we also agreed that last year, for example, that we have to work on a coordination mechanism and a path forward in terms of how we can find ways to implement those norms, but recognizing that each country has its own constraints and considerations, and therefore you must allow for flexibility in that. Now that process is, I think, an important one, and this year, as part of our International Cyber Week, we will be having the ASEAN Ministers meeting, for cybersecurity, again, the AMCC, and we will be discussing how we can take the process forward. And I think the ASEAN experience can inform the deliberations in the UNGGE and the UNOEWG, and also other discussions elsewhere, just as ASEAN's own work will be informed by this. So because it's such a dynamic space, I don't think we should be doctrinal about the way we go about this. We must always recognize the primacy of multilateral work, because that's what is the most inclusive platform is about. but at the same time, allowing for work that is taking place at regional fora and amongst the like-minded countries, because these have a powerful demonstration effect of what is possible. And they can then be, at an appropriate time, multilateralized, as it were.
Murad, your views on the consistencies. Okay, we have ASEAN coming together, agreeing on certain rules and regulations that need to be observed in cyberspace. We have the EU saying they'll agree on rules, norms, standards, and so on and so forth. I mean, can we ensure consistencies while, giving countries, economies some space to maneuver because of their various, conditions?
Again, I'd like to emphasize interoperability as opposed to unanimity, because if you go after unanimous approach, which is ideal, it will take a long time and we will agree on the lowest common denominator. But if you go with an interoperable approach, regions like ASEAN or others can take the lead in adopting certain approaches, then demonstrating to the rest of the world what's working, what's not, and the rest of the world can decide to opt in without waiting for a global consensus. And I'll give a small example on the use of drones, which has security implications and data implications. A small nation called Rwanda is now seen as the drone capital of the world. They used it to deliver blood supply to women who would otherwise die during childbirth. And what we have done in Rwanda, again, through a multi-stakeholder approach, is now becoming a global norm on regulating drones in the much bigger economy. So you don't have to have a large economy or a large block paving the way, but a small country or a region, big region, can really set the norms for what needs to be done and demonstrate what works, what doesn't, and there will be others to follow it. So I think that will be much faster given the pace of technology, and it will allow for innovation coming from different parts of the world.
Aside, your view on this regulatory vacuum would be?
So I think from our perspective, what we've seen is that regulation and cybersecurity in general, when it comes to issues like privacy, when it comes to issues like what's acceptable for a nation state to do directly or indirectly, I mean, those types of norms and regulations have been very, very slow in catching up to where technology is at today, where technology will be at tomorrow. We're still dealing with, for example, in the U.S., implications of what data big tech can use from a consumer perspective, how we can sell that data, monetize that data. There have been certain regulations that we've seen in the U.S. that have come up at the state level, for example, the California Consumer Protection Act. However, a lot of those regulatory standards have been lacking teeth. They haven't been as easy to enforce. They haven't been effectively discussed or litigated against in court. I think the most successful one that we have seen is GDPR. GDPR has been enforced to a great degree. It has led to a number of fines for many companies and organizations that have fallen behind. But I think overall, what we need to do is establish some norms of what is good behavior, bad behavior, what is on the table, off the table, and get all parties to agree, whether those are state, nation parties or big tech and private enterprises. There needs to be sort of coming to the table for these basics. Otherwise, we're going to be continuing being this level of state of chaos.
Murad, let's get your view on this, because you talked about how you want to encourage innovation and perhaps put a lid on regulation. How do you balance the two? What have countries gotten right? What are countries not doing so well?
I'll pick on GDPR that Syed mentioned. It's really focused on privacy of data and use of data in social networks. But there's a lot of data being generated from Internet of Things, where cybersecurity becomes critical. I think rather than looking backward and being punitive in regulation and setting norms, we need to be forward-looking and enabling. And the three aspects of it needs to be transparent, it needs to be equitable, and it needs to be inclusive. For example, on the use of data, what if we can create a mechanism that allows for the owners of data, whether it's individuals, governments, companies, to share data cross borders or within a nation on agreed upon purposes. Let's say finding a cure for cancer. I'm willing to give my genetic data to cure cancer anywhere in the world, so long as it can be used only for that purpose. And we can use technical mechanisms like blockchain smart contracts, for example, to ensure that it's used only for that purpose, much like we do with music, digital rights management. But if it's for a commercial purpose, I want to be asked for my consent. And if I consent to it, I want to get paid. So we need to create a mechanism for the valuation of data for a specific purpose. We have over 100 years of history of doing that in the commodities market. This is how we price oil, soybean, wheat in the international sector. So there are models that we can borrow from the media industry, from commodities trading, and to come up with a mechanism that allows for secure, transparent, and inclusive sharing of data and distributing the dividends associated with it. Data will be the key asset as we move forward in the age of artificial intelligence. And again, we have created a global multi-stakeholder community. Singapore is a very active member of that, to move forward with such an approach. Of course, privacy is important, but if we are completely backward looking at punitive, we're addressing the problems and challenges of the past, but not capturing the opportunities of the future.
Minister, since Singapore was brought up as an example, how does Singapore view regulation, especially for a country that's looking to be an innovation hub? What have been the challenges the country has faced?
Yeah. Well, I think it's the Syed and Murad have both made important points. But I think the starting point must be that innovation and regulation need not necessarily be looked at as mutually exclusive or opposing forces. Actually, if it's done right, regulation and innovation can be mutually reinforcing. And since we've been talking about data, let me use that as a case in point. Because data is obviously a key resource for the digital economy. And yet, if you do not have an environment, a regulatory environment that fosters trust in the use of the data, that the data will be used only for legitimate or appropriate purposes, and it will be safeguarded from a privacy perspective. If you don't have that trust, then the room for using that data for innovation significantly shrinks, because there's going to be a lot more pushback. So you need the two to work together. And in Singapore, we've done things like, for example, what you call regulatory sandboxes. Again, the same thing. Try in a limited way to build the trust and confidence before you can scale. So it's interesting that we are talking about regulation with respect to data, for example, because just today, I tabled in Parliament a bill to amend our Personal Data Protection Act. And from our perspective, taking up Murad's point, I think you need to, the regulation of data has to be contextualized. So there are situations where you need explicit consent from the data owners. There are situations where you can work with what you would call deemed consent, where the person who seeks to use the data would have discharged their responsibility if they have performed certain functions, and the owner of the data does not need to give an explicit response. And there are certain instances where you can work with a set of legitimate use exceptions, where enterprises, as long as they, or for example, or organizations, as long as they have met the standards in terms of securing the data and taken the appropriate safeguards, they can use them for those legitimate purposes. So the point really is this: regulation has to be dynamic and nimble in response to the environment that we're in, because the needs and the way technology is evolving does pose that challenge. But I don't think we should think of regulation as an obstacle to innovation. I actually think it can, they're like the two horses of the carriage, they have to work in tandem, and then the carriage will go in the right way.
There's often that tension between private and public sector. Murad, can the private sector self-regulate when it comes to emerging technology? Can the private sector be trusted to self-regulate?
I think we shouldn't leave it to just the government or the private sector. I think the key is to really create a multi-stakeholder environment, not just the private sector and the government, but also civil society, academia, and other international organizations as well. So I don't think it is whether one community should do it or not, but the key will be to have a multi-stakeholder approach. And business plays a vital role, of course, as we have seen in COVID-19, just creating a supply chain, delivering products. Without business, no innovation will be deployed. We should not, however, forget that we need to be mindful of creating the environment for startups, for small and medium enterprises, which is the backbone for employment and supply chains around the world, to also thrive. So we need to create a balanced approach to ensure that we put so high obstacles for them to adapt, because they need to continue and thrive in this environment. So it's not just the business or the government, it needs to be multi-stakeholder collaboration.
What do you think, Syed? And add to that, do you think, the big boys, your Facebook, Google, Baidu, Alibaba, they've started to dominate the emerging technology landscape? Have they become, I don't know, too big for their own good?
I think a lot of people would agree with that last statement, Hishlima, that big tech, they've been too slow to and too willing to do things that are potentially risky without obtaining proper authorization from people whose data it is that they're selling or monetizing. There's certainly a lot of good that big tech is doing. There's also a lot of innovation that they have been spearheading, which is leveraged across multiple different disciplines and industry sectors. But what's certainly been lacking is a sense of what is acceptable and not acceptable. And I think to Murad's point, unless we bring together these various bodies or groups together at the same table, and also have some form of either a carrot or stick approach that says, if you go outside of these norms that this body is going to deem appropriate, then certain action will be taken against you, or there will be consequences of some sort. I think there has to be a little bit of that both carrot and stick approach, but big tech has shown the willingness to change, to listen, but it's been very, very slow. And one of the things about data is that even with blockchain, ledger type of a control system, once data gets out of the bottle, it's never going back in. So it's the classic genie out of the bottle type of thing. And unlike, I would like to just add a point of clarification to one of Murad's points. Unlike other data that we've seen that's been monetized before, whether it's commodities data or non-personal citizen data, the data from people is most of it is sort of constant, universal. It never changes. So if somebody does find out what your for example, DNA sequence is, or what your genetic code is, that's never going to change, right? And it can be used and misused in so many different ways. So we have to go significantly above and beyond what we've done in the past to control and protect or regulate other types of data. I think we're in a different world now, because we are talking about information about people that is permanent, but also information about people that is sort of continuously updated based on their financial status, their health status, their familiar social status, their educational status. All that information is sort of easy to scoop up right now, given the tools that we already have from big tech.
Your response to that, Minister, I mean, earlier Murad was talking about how it's not just about the private sector or the public sector, not just about the government or the companies. How can all the stakeholders work together to ensure, the security of new standards for emerging technologies like IoT, like 5G?
Yep. So, I've been in the private sector and in the public sector, and now I'm in government of political side. And it's a rare company that wants to be regulated, and it's a rare government that doesn't want to regulate. So actually, it's an interesting tension. And it's a healthy tension as long as the two, it doesn't become a dysfunctional relationship. And I think in the areas that we are talking about, 5G, IoT, AI, and so on, these are very dynamic sectors. Things are changing, and the term evolving that's come up. This is happening at quite a breathtaking pace. So I think we have to start with the recognition that there is no monopoly of wisdom or knowledge on this. I think the companies, the private sector is obviously involved in the cutting edge of application and usage. The public sector, the governments, are dealing with the whole implications of all of these technologies for societies, for the social compact, for the economy and the economic compact, etc., and so on. And if you don't get that right, then, as I said earlier, the space for innovation and using these technologies will shrink very dramatically. So you need this, a mutually beneficial way of working together. So the short answer is, I think we have no choice. You have to do this. And actually, I think it is the best way forward as well, because you need the creativity and the push from the private sector in terms of being at the cutting edge. And then you need the leavening influence of government, because we have to take into account the impact on society and the economy and how we need to bring everybody along as well in this. So we have tried several ways of doing this, but I would say the key thing has really been in building a constructive dialogue between the public and private sector based on mutual respect and trust. Because I think if you take the approach that the government doesn't trust the private sector and the attitude is you're here just to try and take advantage, or if the private sector views the government as basically obstructionist, then I think we have a problem. So we have to start with mutual respect, that we are trying to find an outcome that is in the common good, but we know that we start from different places. Let's try and find a way to make common cause. And that's how we've gone about it in Singapore, in all the sectors that you've talked about. I wouldn't say that our approach is perfect, but certainly we have a lot of positive experiences because of this approach that we have taken.
I want to touch on the digital economy, and I know that COVID-19 has pretty much accelerated the adoption of, digital technology. What opportunities have arisen out of this pandemic? I'd like to pose a question to all the three speakers. Syed, perhaps we can start with you.
Right. Certainly this whole pandemic has changed everything in everybody's lives forever. And I think not just individuals, but also governments and companies. The opportunities that we've seen that are being created are, for the longest time, a lot of the virtual collaboration technology that we have all used over the last decade and a half has been fairly stagnant. It hasn't really been innovated. But what we've seen just in the last 9 months or so has been the acceleration of new tools and technologies that people are using, not just to work together, but also to connect with each other, to do business, in the form of visiting the doctor, going to school, et cetera, et cetera. There's essentially been a maturation, an accelerated maturation of technology for us to do a lot of things that we had to do in person, now remotely in a safe way. I think it's created an opportunity in the sense that there's this new, virtual channel that we are now able to use for doing a lot of things that we were, just not used to doing in the past. And that's going to have a lot of, implications long term, whether it comes to companies rethinking about their corporate workspace. Do they need to have a 3 or 4 story, building in the middle of downtown, or floors in a high-rise building in the middle of downtown that's going to be high cost? Can they have enclaves of people that are sort of, separated or dispersed across a major metropolitan area that are working together and connecting collaboratively, for instance? COVID has also certainly, from the cybersecurity perspective, has accelerated a lot of corporate interest in changing their underlying technology. We've seen companies accelerating their migration to the cloud. We've seen companies really focused on improving access for their remote employees, but also improving access now to their trusted partners and supply chain, partners, et cetera. And what we've also seen is that from a cyber perspective, there have been new tools and technologies and new paradigms that have been talked about for a bit now, such as adoption of software-defined wide area networking, adoption of additional technologies like zero trust architecture that would enable people to connect more securely and access a whole bunch of different technologies safely. All of those things that we've been talking about have now come to the forefront, and we've seen increased momentum both from a provider perspective, companies that are developing these solutions, but also from a adoption perspective on the enterprise side. So there's been a whole bunch of different opportunities that have been created as a result of COVID-19, and a lot of these look like they're going to be permanent, moving forward.
Murad, let's talk about those opportunities and add to that, of course, the risk of a global digital divide. How do you address that gap?
I think, again, COVID-19 slingshot us into 2023. It moved us forward by 3 years in terms of the need for digitization. So it raised the awareness and the mindset. And what we're seeing is not just digitizing what we have been traditionally doing, but reimagining a future where technologies that we have today can be the baseline for what we call the Great Reset. Just think about a scenario where in a country, in an emerging country with hundreds of millions of people, you will never have enough hospitals or doctors or teachers or schools to provide education. What if we create a life coach using an AI agent that stays with you throughout your life and based on your skills and capacities can guide you throughout your life? These are not impossible scenarios to consider. But before COVID-19, we wouldn't have thought about this. We wouldn't have questioned the need for schools to be together or hospitals where healthcare is provided. But the COVID-19 created a new approach in people's minds on how we can leverage that. And the digital divide will be key. Those who have access will propel forward. Those who do not have access will be potentially left forever behind. And this is the area that I think the international community should really focus on, to make sure that connectivity is there, to make sure that we can use the data for the benefit of everybody. Not in an open, everybody gets access to all data, because that's not technically nor commercially viable, but in, as Minister Swaran mentioned, to focus on global commons or agreed purposes and provide the environment for that. So a lot of countries, big or small, are now taking a step back and saying, how do we rebuild based on the available technologies today, rather than just digitizing what we have been doing?
Minister, that is a sobering reality. I mean, they could be left forever behind, Murad's words. How has Singapore dealt with this digital divide, and has COVID-19, I don't know, widened the gap perhaps?
I think it's an interesting question. So I've been involved in this whole effort in Singapore for several years now. And there's been an evolution in terms of the perspective of especially SMEs, but in general in the business community, the attitude towards digitalization has, shall I say, evolved from them thinking of it as a distraction to, okay, it's an option, to thinking that it's a necessity. And now I think in a post-COVID era, people see it as an imperative. I've got to get moving. So if you talk to industry, many would say that, especially those in the sector, that in the last 6 months, we have achieved a transformation that might have taken 3-4 years to bring about. And so the kind of compression that Murad talks about, I think it's, we've really seen an acceleration. So in terms of the divide, or is the digital divide being exacerbated, or is it actually being ameliorated? I think in some ways the divide, in my view, has actually lessened. And the reason is because in terms of an awareness, an acceptance, and a desire to get on with digital transformation, I think we have seen a major change. And so now, and all the sort of surveys, etc., that we see in Singapore, that is no longer the problem. Now it's about the wherewithal, getting it done, and how do I go about doing this? So it's now you're coming down to the brass tacks of it. And that is where the potential for a divide exists, because if you're a smaller enterprise or one that perhaps doesn't quite have the resources or the knowledge, then it becomes a limiting factor that can actually hold you back. I think the point that Murad was making. And this is one of the reasons why in Singapore we've embarked on, and this has been around for some time, but it's taken on a kind of heightened salience in the current environment, is really this national digitalization effort. So for example, with our SME community, we have the SME Go Digital effort, where first we pre-qualify digital solutions. For example, when you talk to most SMEs, The first digital solution they're interested in is a payment solution. The second is an online platform where they can access more markets, more customers. And then they go into, internal to the organization type things around logistics, around HR, accounting, etc., and so on. So there's a certain hierarchy in the way they approach it. So what we have done, working in partnership with industry, is really to see what are the kinds of solutions you can pre-qualify. So you take the thinking, the guesswork out of it for the SMEs. They can come in and there's a plug-and-play solution, and then provide them the resources, so there's some funding support for them to adopt these solutions. That is one way to get the broad mass of companies onto the digitalization platform journey. Get on with the program and start moving. Then, of course, you come into the higher order issues, like those who want to go further and so on. And I think that's where you have to start doing some more customized work. So the short answer to your question, I would say, is A, attitudinally and in terms of the willingness to decide and move, the divide has actually, I think, diminished significantly. In terms of the ability to do it, the digital transformation, that is where the challenge is now, because of the knowledge gap and possibly a resources gap. And that is where a lot of our effort is focused on how we can bring the broad swath of enterprises along with us on this digitalization journey.
Desire and ability. Before I open up the discussion, I just want to bring Murad into this point as well. I mean, we talk about desire and capability to do that. I mean, Singapore could be moving in the right direction, Murad. How about countries like Indonesia, India, where it's so vast and that gap is even wider?
I think it's a great opportunity given the size of the population and the potential impact for new technologies, especially when you have hundreds of millions of people in a country. I think, again, we can really use the technology to scale access to products and services, whether it's education or health, or improving agriculture yields. For example, in India, 800 million people live off of agriculture, but they're smallhold farmers. They will not have access to high-tech solutions. And what we have seen is at the state level, for example, in Telangana and others, to create, again, this multi-stakeholder collaboration environment, using technology as a baseline to improve the lives of people living in a state. And as Singapore has done, if we can create sandbox environments and demonstrate what works, and do it quickly, then it can yield to faster adoption across the country and across the nation. So what happens in one country, in one region, can be a template for how it can be used in the broader communities or bigger countries.
Gentlemen, hang tight. I'm going to invite three speakers to give their views, and I'll get a reaction from you. First off the block, I'd like to invite retired General Keith Alexander, co-CEO and president of INET in the US. Keith, are you with us?
Yes, I just had to get unmuted in my picture in there. How are you doing? So let me start out with a couple of comments. I like the update than the comments that the minister made. So I think he's right on the mark, mutual respect and common good. That really resonates with me. I think the issue that we're wrestling with is the fact that technology is going so fast. It was mentioned, but think about the exponential growth in data, the number of systems that we have on the network, the number of applications, the protocols, and with 5G, how much faster that's going to grow. Data is going to be the common good. And it's going to give us great opportunities. 4G gave us social networking and really has allowed us to get through COVID with VTCs and things like we have today. Now we are into this, going into 5G, and that data is going to grow considerably. And when it grows, it's also going to bring with it risks and vulnerabilities. So the issue that nations will face, that companies face, is how do you protect countries, sectors, companies with this rapid growth in the amount of information that we're handling, recognizing that we can't grow the people as fast as the data will grow. So the number of cybersecurity people that you have is going to go at a small rate. if at all. And the digital realm is going to explode. So we have a problem. We have that problem. So how do we get government and industry working together? That's part one. And you brought up this bipolar world. I think we need to solve that. How do we get nations working together to protect information, to protect intellectual property? And every country has faced that dilemma. So, Minister, as we're looking at that, and as you think about all those issues, I don't mean to dump all of them on you, but I think the key thing from my perspective is, how do we do that in such a way that you aren't polarized going for privacy such that you can't handle security, and vice versa? How do you do both?
Keith, thank you very much for joining us, and I appreciate the question. I think this is the crux of the matter. In our discussions, and let me share with you the perspective. I mean, in our discussions, for example, with our ASEAN neighbors, there is a legitimate concern around data. And if data flows, what does it mean for us? And what is the risk that we're exposing ourselves to? And these risks range from security risks to financial risks to health risks and personal privacy risks, etc., and so on. And at the same time, I think it would be correct to say that the governments also recognize the opportunity in data. I think, one of the things that I often tell people is, please don't think of data as oil, because oil is the kind of commodity where once one person consumes it, the other party doesn't have access to it anymore. Data's value accretes with aggregation and organization and analysis, and therefore we need to find ways to do that. So the way we are going about this and trying to build a constructive thing is, first of all, I think we need to inform our thinking about the way we go about thinking about data. In other words, data has to be thought about as there are different types of data. As you say, with the explosion of IoT and 5G, we're going to generate, a whole lot of data. Some aspects of data, for example, machine-generated data, you could argue is of a lesser sensitivity and should be allowed to flow more freely. Then there's other data which might have some level of personal elements in it, and you need to find ways to share that minimally to have patterns discernible. So you could, perhaps in terms of anonymization and so on, and then you allow that. But then the question is, what is the anonymization algorithm, and how easily is it reversed, and so on? That needs to be addressed. And then there's another set of data which is personal, and which is where you need the common standards in terms of personal data protection. How do I know that the data of my citizens, when they flow into your jurisdiction, it will be accorded the same kind of protection? Now, this thing that I'm talking to you about, actually, it's not really uncharted waters for us, because in a completely different domain, like, say, for example, phytosanitary, food products, pharmaceutical products, we have actually covered similar ground. How do we arrive at mutually acceptable standards so that the drugs or the food or whatever can flow across, and we know it is safe and it is something that we can use because we subscribe to common standards and we know your systems implement them. So, Keith, I mean, the way we are going about it is really to build that understanding arrived at through experience and understanding in a sensitive way the legitimate concerns governments have. And in my conversations with many of the companies, what I've said is, you can't just be the source of the problem, you have to be the source of you have to be part of the solution. And you have to be able to help governments and regulators understand why you need the data, how the data, when it can flow, creates more value, but at the same time also, which aspects, what are you able to do to help the governments appreciate that you will be able to secure the data? And the work we're doing on standards and subscribing to common standards is an important part of that. So the Apex EBPR is a bit more common in our part of the world as opposed to the GDPR in Europe and so on. But it's one of the ways we're trying to do that as well.
Minister, there's a question here. Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, so let me just add to that, because what you bring out, and you described it, I think correctly, that there are different types of data. So let's look at the data that is threat-related cyber data. That data that represents someone trying to get into a private person or a company's network or a government's network. If you think about that data set and you anonymize who's being exploited or attacked and share that widely, you have now a way to help defend individuals, companies, sectors, and nations.
Yep.
The issue becomes people immediately say, well, you're sharing information. But you hit the key point is there are different types of data. And we have to educate people that threat-related data is different. And I would like, from both you, Minister, and from Murat, your thoughts on that, because that's what's going to shape the future of the world.
Indeed.
We share threat-related information, and we should. And I think it's the same in cyber. Over to you, Minister.
Yes, I would say a very quick response to that. A, we need work on the typology of data, which is the point that you're making and I'm making. And secondly, and I think that's a dynamic process because there's going to be a lot more nuances as we go further. And secondly, within each typology, how do we facilitate the flow of data? I'll give you another example from a sector. It's financial services. If a bank has been subject to an attack, a cyber attack, I think it's important that that information is available. If the bank is concerned that by disclosing this to the regulator may take umbrage because saying that your system is not secure, when actually you want to encourage that sharing and in a manner that is not going to be, adverse to their competitiveness, because they don't want their competitors to know what the actual issue was, but they want them to know, we want at the system level the knowledge so that everyone can secure themselves better. So this is the area where I think the regulators have to work with the entities to build that sort of, a circle of trust that is sufficient to allow this kind of flow, even within different typologies of data. I'm not sure whether Murat or Syed have anything else to add on this.
I would like to add, but Murat, please go ahead, and I can add at the end.
Oh, go ahead, Syed. I'll come after you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, look, I think, Keith, excellent question and points. Same to you, Minister. I agree with many of the things that were said, but there are a few things that I just wanted to clarify. I think, first of all, and I'll go, LIFO in terms of the order of the points that were stated. With respect to cyber threat intelligence, most companies get, a dozen feeds, a dozen CTI feeds, some of which are open source, some of which are proprietary and, aggregated by vendors. There's a lot of cyber threat intelligence that's available to both governments and small, medium businesses and large enterprises today. That doesn't seem to be the issue. The issue seems to be much more along the lines of the companies applying that cyber threat intelligence in a way that is efficient and effective. And I think, Keith, that goes to your earlier point, which was around, we don't have enough cyber professionals today. Right now in the U.S., roughly speaking, there are between 400,000 to 500,000 open positions for cybersecurity professionals. Globally, between 3 million to 4 million. And we're not seeing that number decrease. It's only growing over time. It has certainly grown since we started tracking it about 2 or 3 years ago. So I think one of the issues is how do we apply the information that we already have from a cyber threat intelligence perspective to make our companies, governments, entities safer. And we can only do that using technologies like, automation, true machine learning within the cybersecurity solutions that we have, so that we need fewer people and not continuously need to add more people that are already scarce to begin with. That was one of the things I wanted to say. I think the other thing that that came up was around, from a perspective of, and Minister, you made this point around, understanding the overall, it's really the master data model that we have to understand about individuals, about citizens. What is the entire universe? And that universe of data that can be collected or, attributed to an individual is continuously growing. But what is that master data model look like today? What is it going to look like 5 years from now when we have more technology, more sort of bioengineering, if you will, right? And based on that data model, what we have to create is very specific use cases. What is acceptable for a company or a government to do with that data? What is unacceptable? I think that sort of guidance, it doesn't have to be a regulatory standard, but it has to be guidance. That's something that is definitely lacking today, that the governments haven't, done a good job on. And I think the other thing that I wanted to also sort of point out was, from what we have seen, government cannot wait for big tech to come to them and say, hey, this is the data we want to collect, and this is how we want to use it. At least in the U.S., what we have seen is that when big tech does go to the Senate or does go to the House floor, and their executives are speaking about what data is collected, what they're doing with that data, that information is almost useless, right? I think what we need to do from the government perspective and from the standards body perspective is actually be proactive in understanding what data is being collected, what data will be collected or can be collected about people, and how is that being monetized. Going into that, into those discussions with big tech, with that knowledge of information is going to be critical for us to be able to have a fruitful discussion, a productive discussion with them on what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what you should stop doing, what you should continue doing, etc. Right now, at least from my perspective, what I've seen is if the governments wait for big tech to come to them, it's almost a useless discussion. It's a waste of time, really, for the public to tune in and listen to these Senate hearings, for example, that we've seen from multiple executives from big tech.
There's one thing I would like to change slightly of what you said, Saeed, and give you back a little bit more information. You said all the threat information we're receiving. I agree. We share information about threats and you get all the threat feeds. That's not what I'm talking about. And the reason is that we share what we know. We don't share what's hitting our networks and what people are trying to get in. Take 100 banks. Those 100 banks are being probed constantly by threat actors and you can't see it. There is no air traffic control picture for cyberspace for companies. So think about that, and all the threats that are coming in, we don't share that information. But if we did, then the financial sector, the energy sector, the healthcare sector would see these attacks that are trying to come in and would be better protected. That level of information is what I'll call the air traffic control picture for cyber. How do we create that so that companies, sectors, states, and nations can defend themselves? I would take the threat feeds and throw everything in. But I think we need to make a shift. We need to use the network to defend the network and do it in an anonymized way. And that is a cultural shift. And it also means that what we're doing and what you're doing and what the World Economic Forum is doing, it's helping to explain to them, we're not taking your data, we're taking threat data to share it to defend all of us. So that's what I was trying to get there when I talk about threat.
Right. And thank you for the clarification, Keith. I think that makes perfect sense, and I'll just make another quick point here. What we're seeing with respect to what you're talking about, which is, what is a company or what is a group of companies facing today, and really at any given second, that information is now being provided, if you will, by a lot of the cloud cybersecurity companies, whether it's, and I'll just mention a few random names here, like, when it comes to endpoint detection and response technologies for your devices, companies like CrowdStrike, companies like Carbon Black, right? And they have a cloud-based solution that allows them to visibly see what are all the different attack, whether it's attack techniques or attack actors, if you will, that are trying to probe their customers. They're aggregating a lot of that, and they're continuously updating various indicators of attack and compromise on their own solutions and providing that in near real-time way back to their customers. So a lot of the cloud security solutions we have seen that are up and coming now are able to provide a lot of that, but there is still a significant gap, Keith. I totally agree with you. I think not only are we not sharing, companies not sharing information about what they're seeing on their corporate side, but also most companies aren't even aware that they have been compromised, that they have been breached. The number of breaches that we see today that companies are reporting on is just a fraction of what actually has been happening. And I think this goes back to one of the minister's points, which is, companies need to be okay with coming to regulators, the public, and say, hey, we had an issue, whether it was a big or small issue, we had an issue, this is what happened, this is what we know, and this is the information that may be useful to other entities to, prevent this from happening to themselves, for instance.
Maybe we can get Murad's input here before I call the next speaker. Murad, go ahead.
I'd like to make 3 points. Number one, the regulatory aspect. If you look at the new technologies, the foundational technologies that rise, creating the cybersecurity concerns, they have to be regulated on a horizontal basis. What I mean by that is if you regulate the use of data in financial services, in health, in agriculture, in different sectors in a different way, we will get into a situation which Minister mentioned, is one company may take action that's permitted in one domain, but it may be prohibited. We did that study a couple of years ago with Japan and identified as we move to a more digital economy through our center in Japan, we identified across 7 ministries more than 200 rules, regulations that would be in conflict with each other. So I think that's the first thing or one of the key aspects to look at is how do we take a horizontal view into regulating the use of data in this case. The second one is we talk about threat data or health data or agriculture data or genetic data. I think what we need to do is shift our thinking to what purpose will this data be used for, and look into creating a trusted, transparent, secure, and equitable way for the use of this data. For example, Syed, you mentioned my gene data, genetic data. If you can reimagine consent along the lines that Minister mentioned, that is explicit consent, deemed consent, or implicit legitimate exceptions. If I can say, as I mentioned earlier, my data can be used for this purpose. Now, I did mention blockchain. I was not referring to the ledger piece, but if I can attach a contract to that data, smart contracts, and I can actually encrypt it using homomorphic encryption and create a protocol between the user and the consumer, the provider of the data, to comply with this contract that is explicit, much like we're doing in the media sector in digital rights management. Then the consumer's use of that data or the user of that data will be limited to the consented piece. And even if the data may be copied, it may not be the people who get the data may not be able to use it because the consent is not attached to it. It requires a lot of technical architecture changes and regulatory changes, which we're working on. And finally, if you look at international cooperation and multi-stakeholder collaboration in the sharing of threat data, we're seeing a lot of interest from private sector companies and governments from around the world, the willingness to share that. And we have an initiative on this specific topic. And I think if we can address the horizontal regulation of the use of these technologies, creating a purpose-oriented way to share data and enforcement mechanisms, and create the multi-stakeholder collaboration environment for people to share data without really creating vulnerabilities for them, I think we can address these challenges.
I'd like to invite our second speaker, Tammy Tom, CEO of Ensign Singapore. Tammy, go ahead.
Hi, could you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Hi, thanks for having me. Hi, Minister. Good
Hi.
to see you again.
Hi, Tammy.
I think it's been a fantastic discussion on data, right? The data flow, and I like to pivot to technology, right? If I may. So I've got a couple of questions here for the panelists, and I really need a lot of help here, right? So these are the questions that I have in relation to the bifurcation of technology development and adoption. I guess my question would then be, with the tech world increasingly being influenced by the politics of the West and China, right? And this obviously has implication on partnership and markets that companies choose to enter, right? I guess a question for the industry, which is totally relevant here is, how should businesses think about geopolitical dynamics when it comes to international operations? And to be honest, in Ensign here, I have that problem. And I try to wrap my head around it. And I really like the panel to help me in giving advice in terms of if I'm thinking of expanding globally, right? How do I navigate these, geopolitical issues? So I'd really like to listen to some good answers to this. Thank you.
Minister, would you like to start off?
That's more than a pivot. That's an arrow. I'm not sure I'm fully qualified to answer all of it, but let me just give you my perspective in terms of the approach. The first thing I would say is, because I think in making business decisions, you have to make them against the backdrop of what you see happening, not just in terms of great power rivalry, but also in terms of possible scenarios and how the rest of the world is going to adapt. And my sense of it is, bifurcation or otherwise, it goes back to the point that Murat made earlier. I think actually, having different technology regimes is not new. Those of us who are familiar with telecoms, there was a time when Japan had its own standard, Europe had its own standard, the US had its own standard, and we basically people just got on with it, right? And then when you go to Japan, you get a new handset and you go there and you do it, and so on. So I think the key point is interoperability. So you may well have different ecosystems evolving, right? But can those systems interoperate because you have the standards and so on? So it's not so much that you have a wall, a non-permeable wall, but maybe you have a membrane that's, that allows osmosis and reverse osmosis, that you can have flow across the barrier. So I think that's what most governments will be working towards. And because I don't really see an environment where there will be, it'll be quite inimical to the interests of both countries, by that I mean the US and China, to have a complete decoupling. Because the level of interdependency is quite high. And therefore, a complete decoupling will result in not just problems for the rest of the world, but even for their own economies. So my sense is, you're probably going to have to find a modus vivendi going forward, and that's what all countries are working towards. And the shape of it is likely to be, if we can make it happen, is really one where you have more interoperability, and guided by standards and so on, and norms. And then you may well have the technology itself evolving in different ways, but the foundation of it allows it to still work together. I'm sure Murat or Said would be able to add to that.
Well, I can jump in. What I would say is joint international efforts as an amplifier and accelerator, because as a single company, no matter how big it may be, will be very hard to, I think, navigate these waters. We certainly at the World Economic Forum have a number of initiatives in that domain, as gathering small companies, startups, innovators, as well as big companies around the table, the governments, to address critical issues such as the one that you are raising. And we can take it offline, and I can provide some more guidance on what we're doing. But there are other initiatives that I would recommend you join to have a seat at the table and to have your voice raised. And given the criticality of these technologies like yours, I think you will get a very receptive audience to your concerns.
Yeah, the only other thing that I would add, Tammy, would be, if you're thinking about expanding internationally, right, a lot of the countries, for example, in Africa, are predominantly leaning towards the Huawei and some of the Chinese standards, right? So if you're going to be operating in an area or a country that is already leaning one way or the other, you have really no choice but to go with whatever their bifurcated standard or approach is. From a perspective of your company, you certainly need to start thinking about some redundant operations, some spend you would not necessarily have otherwise when it comes to this interoperability sort of membrane, if you will, as the minister said, which is going to be how do you very quickly send data from the one standard, one bifurcated country standard to your main operations or another region of operations that you have. So planning for those types of expenses and overhead, I think is going to be an important part of the equation moving forward. But you're certainly going to have your feet in both bifurcated pools, so to speak.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, right? So increasingly, as we consult our clients, what comes back very often is the client looking to us to provide the direction, right? In this such polarized tech landscape, look, even for my company or my clients' businesses, we're going to, we're going to be doing digital, right? Digitalization is such a big thing. And, the question has always been, right, do we take sides? I would prefer not to take sides, but is that even possible, right? So it's always this dilemma, right? Whether we have to take sides and how do we decide between the different solutions providers, whether should they be from the US or it should be from China. So a lot of time the clients are even looking to us to provide very good answers for those sort of things. And to be honest, right, I find it quite challenging, right, to be navigating this very complex geopolitical landscape. So I thought, looking to the panel, right, with your wisdom and expertise would help me to maneuver this.
Well, actually, Tammy, if I can just add one other thing. I don't think, I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to give you any further wisdom on this, but here's the thing. I think it is productive to shift the conversation, whether it's with clients or with others, away from the identity of the solution provider to what are the attributes you want in the system you are developing. So if you take, for example, Singapore and our own 5G effort, when we did the call for proposal and eventually made the award, we emphasized very clearly that what we were focused on was the resilience, the security, resilience of the system, the security of the system, and we wanted vendor diversity, right? And then the point was that whoever wanted to apply for the license had to satisfy our regulator and the relevant authorities that they met the standard. So I think, unless there is already a political decision that has been made in the particular jurisdiction, in which case then, as Syed says, I think the choice becomes kind of fait accompli. But otherwise, I think it's very constructive and productive to focus on the fundamental. What are you looking for? And then to curate a solution on that basis. And I imagine that if I were involved in the commercial side, this is how I would go about the work and in the way I would advise the clients. I don't know if others have a thought on that.
Right. Thank you, Minister. I think that's, that's very wise, right? Which is, we'll take that approach to look at the requirements, look at what is good, and, just throw the other geopolitical factors at the back of our mind. Yeah. I agree.
Thank you for that, Tammy. Thanks for your input. Let's get our third speaker, Shafiq Dawood of Group IB. Shafiq?
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm unsure why I'm unable to start the video.
You're a disembodied voice.
Hello again, Minister. Yeah, now I'm able to start my video.
Excellent. Okay.
The light is making it look like as if it's a halo. Hello, everyone. What a wonderful set of panelists. It's good to see you again, Minister Haslinda and everyone. I think everything has been mentioned in this panel so far, ranging from regulatory frameworks to even technology. And I am so amazed. Minister Iswaran spoke of the difference between encryption and hashing earlier. I thought thoroughly, absolutely, I fell off my chair, in fact. We were just speaking about this in Group IB. And I would like to just add on a little bit on this panel based on what Tammy had mentioned, because we're in the business of technology. Group IB works even very closely with the likes of Ensign. And I'd like to just echo a few sentiments here to add to the knowledge base. I agree firmly with Minister Iswaran on the element that innovation and regulation shouldn't be opposing forces. It's about multilateral convergence of in a technological standpoint, but also on a regulatory standpoint. Why is this close to my heart? Because Group IB is a company that catches criminals, that actually provides threat intelligence, and we work closely with public sector and private sector in order to accomplish this. And there are many different gray areas that we tread upon where if there are no common standards. So we work with parties, the likes of Europol, so as to manage that element of being able to work towards catching cyber criminals on a transnational perspective. I loved as well what Syed said about Carbon Black and CrowdStrike, but I think we need to have a chat because Group IB also does a lot of stuff pertaining to cloud-based solutions such as that. But I think Keith rallied a very strong point that resonated with me. 5G is coming up. A lot of data will be, produced. There will be need to innovate quite quickly, and regulation needs to be in tandem with that. That's why it's amazing, because if I recall carefully, the topic here was securing partnerships, securing emerging technology. So CSA has done a brilliant job with co-innovation funding, which actually brings about such startups and such big companies to formulate new machine learning and artificial technologies that allow for exactly what he mentioned, which is typology of data, segregation of data, contextualization of that data, in order for us to get expedient results in an arena by which time is always against us. When a bank gets hit and an incident response is required, when a nation state attempts to attack and the operational technology sector of a power plant, which we have seen quite often occur in countries, when the magnanimity of the amount of data losses coming out of like places which I heard earlier on, like Indonesia, and whether the laws, in this case would be the OJK, similar to the MES, the Otoritas Jasa Keuangan, whether they have the maturity of those set of laws that can cooperate in a very consortium-based approach. So that's why the shift towards my thinking in my operation in my market in APAC has led us to go towards a very consortium-based approach in banking. When we got huge amounts of compromised data cards, like 544,000 cards in India alone, 100,000 in Malaysia. These items are systemic of certain failures along the way. And that's where it's a convergence of threat intelligence alongside with the workings with regulatory agencies for us to stem and get the necessary information on time to basically catch these cyber criminals. I would like to ask a question now, since Tammy got a chance to ask the question, so I'm going to ask a question now. In terms of an ASEAN standpoint for APAC, and this question is directed to Minister Iswaran, are we mooting new regulatory frameworks, kind of like the EU in itself, when I believe last year, EU sanctions, in 2019, they made new laws that allowed for EU sanctions to impose things like asset freezes, to not only natural or legal persons, entities or bodies who are responsible for cyber attacks or maybe attempted cyber attacks. I know Singapore is at the forefront, especially in terms of a lawmaking perspective. Look at the maturity of how fast our PDPA and GDP, worked in tandem towards, making the alignment towards things like GDPR. Are we taking steps, in the forefront of creation of legal frameworks, in an ASEANic perspective?
Yeah. So I think it'll be. I think I could best characterize it as a collective journey where the different member states are moving at a pace that they are more comfortable with. And what we are trying to do in terms of the work, not just with the ASEAN ministers for cybersecurity, because in fact now ASEAN has brought the ministers in charge of the digital economy together, right? And so I think that is a more holistic way of looking at it, because if you just look at cybersecurity, or if you just look at data regulation, or you just look at AI, it's basically touching different parts of the elephant. You need that holistic view. And that then will, engender not just a better understanding, but also a more informed approach to what needs to be regulated, what can be left alone, and where you may need to do some experimentation and so on. So that's one of the areas that we're working on within ASEAN. From a data standard point of view, and in terms of what might be the way we go forward, the APEC CBPR is probably the model that most ASEAN countries would be gravitating towards, because that's what several ASEAN countries have already subscribed to in some shape or form. And so that might be the model. Then there's, of course, the question, if you are on the APEC CBPR, and then if you're trying to deal with the EU, then you need this data adequacy type of arrangement, and that needs to be sorted out. And those are the areas we'll have to cross. But in the same vein, besides the work that we are doing within ASEAN, Singapore is also, you would have heard about our work on digital economy agreements with Australia, with New Zealand, Chile, and we are looking at others whom we can work with. Like-minded and prepared to try some things in this arena. And this is part of the work that we are going on. So I don't think we will end up having one model or one piece of legislation, because it's frankly a bit too ambitious given the dynamic nature of the environment and also the very varied interests of the member states, various concerns. But I think what we can do is, like we have done in cybersecurity, first converge on the basic norms or principles, and then look at ways to give effect to them through some perhaps binding understandings, or if not binding, then at least rules that we could subscribe to, but give each member state some time to then bring the system up to speed on it. And in the same time, then work with members, with partner countries outside ASEAN, because that also has a very strong demonstration effect. And we've got dialogue partners, including the likes of Australia, New Zealand, and Korea, and Japan, and US, and so on, who would be able to work with us on this.
Thank you very much, Minister. And just a last note from me, I think as an element of sharing rather than questioning to our fellow folks down in the US and everyone else, I think in Singapore, Group IB has attempted to do a lot of work together with higher institutes of learning, like universities, polytechnics, and even the Institute of Technical Education, forging new memorandums of understanding, because I believe Syed was the one who mentioned in terms of the number of cybersecurity specialists being lacking. And, we have so many different streams of technological innovation being so agile and fast. So curriculum in itself also comes into play in terms of its agility. So we're working with parties from across different tiers of the educational institutions. And you'd be amazed at some of the stuff that they are capable of in terms of the digital forensics elements, the creation of labs, and bridging even into the sector of operational technologies. And I strongly am a proponent of educating the next generation of cyber specialists. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. I think we just have enough time for a wrap up from all our speakers. Let's get some key takeaways. Syed, perhaps we can start with you.
Sure. So, I think key takeaways, and I'm assuming this is key takeaways for me or key takeaways for what we would like the group to leave with or the audience to leave with.
From you, I mean, how do you view perhaps the developments that you see perhaps 5 years down the road? I mean, how optimistic are you? What can be achieved?
Right. A lot of the stuff that the minister, for example, was mentioning, and some of the things that Murat also said were news to me in terms of, the APAC is it CDPR or CPPR? That's something that I think is encouraging. I haven't looked into that yet. So it's good to see that there has been, globally, a lot of movement both within the private and public sector in terms of establishing standards, getting various stakeholders together. And, as Shafiq was mentioning, establishing memorandums of understanding between entities, between the education sector. Some of the things that I can sort of relate to that would be, just last week I was on a call with a bunch of high school students in the U.S. from a underprivileged part of the city that were interested in cybersecurity. Were already taking classes to obtain a certificate in basic incident response and things like that. So overall, there is certainly a lot of, I think from my perspective, optimism in terms of what's happening, both on the education side, but also in the private and public sector side. There's been a lot of dialogue now, but I think we're still very far from where we need to be, given how fast, again, a lot of the points that were stated, how fast technology is evolving and how far ahead a lot of the big tech players are. There are a lot of documentaries, for example, on Netflix that I would encourage you to watch around the state of privacy or, the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, et cetera, that really, shine a light on, what's already transpired several years ago that we still haven't caught up to, right? So I think those are some of the things that we need to really emphasize, shine some light on and help resolve collectively, collaboratively across nations, not just a U.S. or China or Singapore issue, right?
Murat?
I think we're just at the dawn of the potential use of these technologies. We focus on data on social networks, but there's a lot more data coming from things, Internet of Things, which can again be put to common global good use. Again, I'll emphasize environment, agriculture, health. So we're just at the beginning. And I think we should focus on interoperability, not unanimity. We should focus on common purposes across multiple nations. We should focus on multi-stakeholder collaboration and demonstrate the possibilities so that the rest of the world can choose to adopt it. And if we can do that, do it in a transparent, secure, and inclusive manner, I think the future will be much brighter and much better than what we have seen in the past.
Minister, your final thoughts.
Well, I think what Murat has says resonates for me. I think this is a forum where we've got both public and private sector participants. So the first I would say is, I think we should be focused on building coalitions at the national level, whether it's at the multilateral level or at the regional level or at bilateral level, in order to take the process forward in this very dynamic arena. And we're talking about data, 5G, IoT, AI, etc. The second point is, I think we need stronger public-private collaboration based on mutual trust and mutual respect, recognizing that both parties have legitimate concerns, but also can bring value. And the third is to see innovation and regulation as really complementary forces in this endeavor, not to see them as competing or one constraining the other or the other trying to outwit one, but it's more about working in a collaborative manner so that we can foster the trust in the ecosystem that will allow innovation to thrive.
And on that note, I'd like to thank all our speakers for their insights today, as is Warren, Singapore Minister in charge of cybersecurity, Murat Sonmez, Managing Director, World Economic Forum, and Said Ali, co-head of Bain & Company's Global Cybersecurity Advisory. Thank you so much, gentlemen, and thank you all for joining us. Do take care.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Aslinda. Thank you very much.
And good night from Singapore.
Thank you, Ms. Amin, and our panelists for the very engaging discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of the SICW 2020 Fireside Chat. If you'd like to watch the session at your own convenience, the Fireside Chat will be available on the video on demand from the 7th of October, 2020. We look forward to meeting you again virtually tomorrow, 8 p.m. Singapore time, for the SICW 2020 opening ceremony and ministerial roundtable opening session. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening ahead.